Yeah, okay. As long as you see my lips move, you know I'm still alive. Okay, I'd like to... You can hear me? Okay. I'd like to begin today with 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Begin with verse 1. I think it's important from time to time to reorient ourselves to the basic fundamental simplicity of what the Christian life really is, because ordinary life out in the world and in our jobs and in our occupations and in our interactions with other people, in ordinary life things get very complicated, and I think you probably agree with that. A lot of complexity in life, a lot of difficulties, lots of problems, and we deal with those kinds of complexities and problems and difficulties all through the week. And what we need, especially when we come together on Sunday, is relief from all of that. And we don't need to make it worse. We don't need to make it more complicated. I like what Jesus said in his beautiful invitation in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. He said, "Come to me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest." He didn't say, "Come to me and I'll make it worse." He said, "Come to me." But I think sometimes our church experience is that way. Things get very complicated and very busy, and if we're not careful, we do just the opposite of what it's supposed to be. So I wanted to use this text today to kind of help us to reorient our attention to what really is the fundamental fact and truth about the Christian life. Paul here is writing to the Corinthians, and he says in chapter 11, verse 1, "Would to God you could bear with me a little in my folly, and indeed bear with me, for I am jealous over you with a godly jealousy. For I have espoused you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ." Notice that he uses this metaphoric language, this beautiful, even almost poetic language, describing the Christian life as he has brought the Corinthians, and by extension we are in the same category. He brought them and espoused them, or married them, to Christ. He presents it not as a set of doctrines or a set of rules or some kind of propositions or assertions or an argument or a philosophy, but a relationship. He says, "I have brought you, Corinthians, into a relationship with a person named Christ. I have espoused you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ." Notice again that he didn't espouse them or marry them to an organization or to a club or to a church or to a group of people, but to Christ personally. Just like that invitation I gave you before of Jesus, "Come to me," he said, "I'll give you rest." But look at what it says in verse 3. "But I fear, lest by any means, as the serpent beguiled Eve through his subtlety, so your minds should be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ." Now he refers back to the very beginning of the Bible in Genesis, in the Garden of Eden. He makes reference to Adam and Eve, who, if we'll think back to that account in Genesis when God made man and made Adam and Eve, he made them, and they came into life because he breathed life into them. And the only thing they knew really was, we're alive, and here's God, and here we are. And we really don't know what they did. The Bible doesn't tell us anything that they did in the Garden of Eden. I mean, we have some little hints at things, that they talk about dressing and keeping the garden. But, it doesn't really say that God put them to work doing anything. All we do read about is that God came down in the cool of the day. Actually, in the Hebrew language, the word is ruach, which means the spirit of the day. He came down to them, and they walked together, Adam and Eve and God. And we don't know how long that went on before, as Paul says here, they were corrupted from that simplicity. But that was, I would say, a very simple kind of a relationship, or a life, because it was a relationship. It wasn't a job, it wasn't a task, it wasn't things to do. It was just a relationship with God. And, I'm sure they didn't worry about, well, what is he going to make us do today? They just walked with God. And really, I think that's a good analogy for our lives, because I think he's got the same idea for us, just to walk with us in our... We all do different things, of course, in our life, but he wants to be part of that and walk with us and help us in those things. But Paul here says, "I fear, lest by any means, as the serpent beguiled Eve through his subtlety." You see, what fouled it up and what messed it up and what ruined it in the Garden of Eden, that very simplicity of that life that Adam and Eve had, was the serpent, who I believe, I guess if I could sort of imagine his motivations, was probably jealous and wanting to spoil that relationship. I heard something last week, this, what I'm about to tell you, is not in the Bible. It's part of other other cultures' traditional ideas about some of these biblical things. And I heard during this last week a traditional idea that when God made the angels, first of all, they were His highest creation and very, I guess, proud of their status. This is not in the Bible, by the way. This is just somebody's idea trying to explain Satan or the devil and his motivation. And when God made man, He then came and said, now I have made something higher. Man is now the highest of my creation. And then the Bible does say that man is especially in Christ, the highest point of creation, and that the angels should now serve man. And well, Satan, being very proud, refused to do that, and that was the source of his fall. But at any rate, that's not in the Bible, but that's just a theoretical idea, somebody's idea. He evidently wanted to spoil this special relationship that God had with man. So He couldn't do it by force. He couldn't do it by any other means than by corrupting or spoiling or changing the ideas or the attitudes of Adam and Eve. And so, as you know, the story is that God told them that there's one tree not to eat of, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And Satan came and tempted Eve and said, well, you know, if you notice this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that's what you really need, by the way. You need this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That God said, don't eat of it because you'll die. Well, God's just lying to you. He won't really die. He knows that you'll be smart like Him. You'll be just like God. And He tempted, actually, the temptation of Adam and Eve was to be like God. He tempted them to be like God, we might say, independent of God. What they should have said when He came and said, if you eat this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you'll be like God, they should have said to Him, hey, we're already like God. He made us that way. I mean, how much more like God can we be? We can walk and talk with Him. They were, as a matter of fact, so like God that they could have communion and fellowship with Him. But at any rate, the serpent came and tempted them, and here's the essence of his temptation. There's something more you need to do other than what God has already done. Did everybody hear that? There's something more you need to do other than what God has already done. And the truth is, there wasn't anything more. They could not improve upon what God had already done to create. God created the relationship with Adam and Eve by creating Adam and Eve. Is that right? And there's nothing more that they needed to do to improve it. It couldn't be improved upon. It was already complete and perfect. Well, the analogy is in our lives as Christians, we have that same relationship with God, complete and perfect by virtue of what He has done. And there is nothing more that we can do, and there's nothing more certainly that He's asking us to do to improve upon it. But I would like to say what Paul says here, I fear lest by any means, as the serpent beguiled Eve through his subtlety, so listen, your minds is where your thinking takes place, should be corrupted. To be corrupted, you could say, turned aside or distracted from the simplicity that is in Christ. Now, the idea that it's the simplicity that is in Christ is based on the fact that it's just one single thing. The basis of our relationship with God is just a single thing on our part. It's just one single thing. It's just our faith in Him. And that's all. Just our trusting in Him. And that is the whole basis of the relationship on our part. The only thing He wants from us. The only thing He expects from us. Anton, could you give me Galatians chapter 2, verse 20? I want to notice how Paul sums it up. This very simple idea. This is a long verse, and I'm going to actually focus on the second part. The first part says, I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, Christ lives in me. Now notice this last part. This is what I want to focus on. He says, the life that I now live in the flesh, he's telling us how he lives, how he orients himself to this life that he's living in the flesh. And by the way, we all live in the flesh too, in this physical world, in physical bodies, dealing with physical frustrations, problems, and challenges. And all these things that would tend to complicate life. He says, this, Paul says, is how I orient myself to this life in the flesh. I live by the faith of the Son of God. Or we could say it this way, I live by faith in the Son of God. Now, you notice how simple that is? How he doesn't have 20 different things. Well, here's how I deal with life in the flesh. I've got 10 things I do every day, or 25 things. And it could grow to many things, And by the way, there's lots of things we do, but he says, this is the way I orient myself. Notice how simple it is. I live by faith in the Son of God, and by the way, here's what I mean by that, who loved me and gave himself for me.